for us? Great. So welcome everybody to today's culture webinar, More Than Just Money, Public and Private Funding for Cultural and Creative Sectors. So my name is Karen McGuire, and I oversee the Local Employment and Economic Development Program here at the OECD, which is about to celebrate its 40th anniversary next year. And this program is where we house in the OECD the work on culture and creative sectors, in particular because of the critical importance it can play and the role it has in employment, in innovation, in social impact, that you can really capitalize on at the local scale and have that scale up to, of course, big international trade and investment. So I think just as a reminder, of course, that culture and creative sectors have gained in political visibility tremendously in the last couple of years, both with COVID, but with also other international convenings. And in particular, for example, the G20, we have ministers talking really about the importance of culture, not only within the culture ministries, but even beyond, and the importance for finance ministries, for ministries of economy and innovation, employment, etc. So really trying to highlight the importance of thinking about culture and creative sectors from a wide range of ministries in order to culture-proof, if you will, policies and also help mainstream them. I think, today this is the fourth of a series of seminars that we are doing. And we'd like to thank the European Commission for their support and financing, but also our partners, the European Creative Business Network, World Cities Culture Forum, and the International Council of Museums that are participating in this very particular series where we've looked at a number of different issues. So today we're going to be focusing on the question of finance, both the trends in terms of public finance from support to an investment orientation, and also taking a deep dive into what are some of the new trends with respect to private financing. And, at a time when we hear about, movie production, even looking at non-fungible tokens as a way to support financing. So if we could just go back on the slide, please. So I think, I just want to flag that some of the prior events that we first had one looking really at the importance of the role of cultural participation and how that is critical for both social impacts on health and well-being and other aspects of social inclusion, but also as a driver of the economy, because not only the importance for professionals within the culture and creative sectors, but also the large number of cultural and creative professionals that are working outside. And in some cases, half of them are actually working outside in a wide range of sectors throughout our economy. I'd also like to highlight, we had another seminar focused on employment and skills that was hosted virtually by Glasgow City region. And we also had a nice feature on music in the nighttime economy. And there we really tried to look at a lot of the issues associated with what we can do to boost the conditions for employment in these sectors, and also how to capitalize on these culture and creative skills. We've also had another seminar earlier this year, virtually hosted by Flanders, looking at the importance of support for finance for SMEs and entrepreneurship, and also how to ensure proper business development support for the sector. And we had a zoom in on book publishing. So all of those prior sessions are online. This one will be online too, so you can share with your other colleagues afterwards that they can listen in. But I think, the important thing is to get right to the heart of the matter, because we have a lot of interesting work to do and a lot of great speakers who are going to share their stories. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Katia Travkina, who helps coordinate this work on culture, creative sectors, and local development, and have her launch the meat of the discussion. Katia?
Yes, thank you so much, Karen, and welcome to all. Yes, I wanted to share maybe a bit of a scoping presentation just to kick off our discussion, and maybe my colleagues can give me the right to share now. Yes, almost there. Yeah, that's me. Yes, I'll go back to introduce the speakers later on, but I wanted to maybe to provide a bit of a background and just to share a bit of research that we have been doing on this theme on, well, what are the big trends and issues in public and private finance for cultural and creative sectors. Well, maybe before we start, it's good to, yeah, well, Karen already provided a bit of rationale why the OECD is working on this subject, culture. Well, we thrive to support governments in mainstreaming culture beyond cultural policies and as a part of other policy agendas such as employment, social cohesion, innovation. We also advise how governments can adapt their policies on employment, social protection, innovation, and SMEs to the needs of creative firms. We try to close this very famous gap in terms of measuring the economic and social impact of creative sectors. And we also support capacity building for national and local governments to integrate culture in broader economic and employment and social development strategies. So as Karen mentioned, in fact, throughout this year, even more, we have been preparing a report that will be issued early next year, and will focus on trends and issues in cultural and creative sectors across OECD. We'll look into cultural participation, jobs, firms, and this important issue of funding as well. So yeah, another thing maybe to kick off is why, in fact, it's important to support and to invest in culture. Well, it's important because of all these different direct and indirect benefits that cultural and creative sectors bring in terms of job creation, but also in terms of regeneration of our cities and rural areas, social impact, etc. And of course, it's important to support culture to ensure fair access and preservation of heritage that we can pass from past generations to the future generations. So it's a little bit with that logic that in the 20th century, governments across OECD and other countries, of course, were supporting culture as a sort of merit good, like health or education. But then with the growing recognition of the economic impacts of cultural and creative sectors, this policies shifted a little bit from market failure approaches to industrial policy approaches. And now, well, of course, this is an area of investment for, of course, cultural policies, but also beyond cultural policies, and many other policy strands and ministries are investing in culture. So maybe let's have a little bit of look on data and what does data show us. We can see that over the past decade, the government spending on cultural services has been decreasing, in fact, and represent 1.2% of total spending across OECD countries. Not shockingly big number, I must say. So, maybe it is also good to have a look at the longer time horizon. So for like time horizon of the last 20 years. And we can see that from 2001 up until the global financial crisis, the spending was increasing. Then obviously it dropped, and it failed to reach the level seen before 2009. What is also interesting to see is that the shares of subnational government spending on cultural services are much higher than national shares. And we can see from this data that 60% of total public expenditure towards cultural services is made by subnational governments. And this spending represents 3%, well, compared to 1.2% of national spending. So that's they play a very important role in terms of funding. And obviously, subnational government spending on recreation, culture, and religion varies considerably within countries. So you can see here some examples from Belgium, Italy, United Kingdom, and Canada. And we must say that subnational government finance has been strongly hit by the current crisis since 2020. And this is something that we maybe need to remember in our discussions today. What are the prospects over the medium and long term? Because we know, of course, now there are massive investments through the recovery funds as well. But what's the prospect for the medium and long term? That's the big question. Now, what is another source of funding? So quite a big chunk of money comes from our own pockets, us as people, households. We spend money on recreation and culture. And in fact, this spending category grew quite fast, by 18% over the past decade, and twice as fast as overall spending. So we can say that households spend more on recreation and culture than on restaurants and hotels, furnishing and household equipment, or clothing and footwear. But obviously, this household spending was clearly very much impacted by the crisis. So we can see from this data that per capita spending on recreational and cultural services dropped by about 30% on average across OECD countries. So that's not a very good picture indeed. Another aspect we need to keep in mind when we speak about funding for culture is that, well, culture and creative sectors are very diverse. So of course it's libraries, museums, film production companies, architectural companies, visual artists, design, very diverse players, very diverse objectives and missions for these players, and very diverse business models, combining non-for-profit, profit, and sometimes blended business models. And of course, their finance needs are very different as well. So here, maybe it's good to have a bit of an overview of funding sources. So of course, there is a lot of money, especially for startup phases, comes from self-finance. And these are the famous family, friends, and fools who invest in an idea of their dear one sometimes. Then, of course, obviously, the public support is extremely important, and this can come through direct grants or tax incentives or voucher schemes. And here we can, for example, think about an example from Colombia, where in 2017, the country introduced a zero income tax for 7 years for creative startups to encourage FDI investment. And the result is that, yes, there were quite considerable shares of FDI drawn into this sector. Or another example is the Art Bonus in Italy, also quite an effective scheme, introducing tax exemption to incentivize private and corporate investment in cultural heritage and cultural production. 500 million euros since 2014, so quite a successful scheme as well. Or another example is Wallonia Creative Voucher, which in fact offered to SMEs, these vouchers are offered to SMEs to develop creative innovations with businesses from creative industries. So it's SMEs in other sectors, traditional sectors, get this voucher to work with the creative business to develop innovation. Another example is quite an interesting one, and introduced already quite some time ago, is the Japan Hometown Tax, introduced in 2008, and it offers tax deduction for people who want to donate to a local government of their choice. And of course, this donation can also go to culture and creative sectors. And also, well, these vouchers are being also increasingly used to increase and to break the barriers for some of the target groups. And for example, in France, Pass Culture was introduced during the pandemic, in fact, to encourage access of youth to cultural consumption. So they receive 300 euros that they can spend to go to museums or cinema over 2 years, or over 24 months. Then in terms of funding sources, of course, there is a traditional debt finance available for creative firms, as it is for all other SMEs and businesses. But we know that we know all the usual barriers that creative firms face when accessing debt finance, that not all lending institutions know how to evaluate intangible assets and other things. So to correct this, for example, in the UK, the Creative England investment program introduced startup loans and scale up capital to help firms in creative sectors. Then, of course, well, there is equity finance, business angels, and venture capital, and we'll have some of them later today in our second session. And here, one of the good examples can be, for example, the Motai Fund from Korea. It's a state venture capital investment fund that offers matched funding to private investors. And of course, across sectors, and a lot of money was going to the film, music industry in Korea, which are extremely successful, as we know. And well, this other category is in fact a very important one. It includes philanthropy, sponsorship, and patronage. And in fact, this was the funding source for centuries for culture. Now, of course, it was also quite extremely developed in North America, in the US, but also in Europe, it's also gaining ground, and the foundations are more and more moving from giving money to projects to managing projects and managing investments themselves. And we'll hear more today from the Cultural Foundation on, for example, on Culture of Solidarity Fund that was introduced recently to support the culture throughout the pandemic. And obviously, when we think about culture, crowdfunding also comes to mind. And crowdfunding is very useful to raise collateral to get credits, but also, well, to help with the startup phase, obviously, and help demonstrate the market potential to traditional investors. And we'll also have with us one of the most successful for crowdfunding schemes from Spain, Goteo. And I really look forward to discussing it more in the afternoon. Yes, maybe to just finish, let's maybe have a look at what are the big trends and the big questions maybe for today and more broadly. So we can see that, well, obviously, the crisis impact on cultural and creative sectors was very dramatic. And despite the massive supports that were provided by governments, by the private sector, by philanthropy, the sector may not bounce back quickly. Well, why? Because the income and revenue losses continue. There was reduced investment in future production. Well, maybe it's a question mark, but also the availability of private funding for the sectors may also be reduced. And as we've seen earlier, there might be a likely reduction of public funding over the medium and long term. That's a question mark. Let's discuss. So what could be the responses? Well, these are very high-level responses, but yeah, we also advocate that governments should view culture as an investment, not a cost. And well, of course, it's very important to continue this support throughout the pandemic and the crisis. And it's important for the public sector also to play an orchestrator role to strategically channel all these different sources of funding and actors to areas of social and economic impact, along with providing a stable regulation. And of course, it's also important to deal with these issues of access of creative firms to bank credits. Well, here maybe it's a good place to pledge for better data as well on the economic performance of the sectors and on their needs. So I think maybe I provided some of the hints for our later discussion, and I'll stop here. And maybe we can now introduce, I can go on to introduce finally our dear speakers who had the time to join us today. So I'm stopping my share screen, and yes. So today we have a real chance to have a particularly interesting panel of speakers representing different realities, so sectors, but also national governments and local government cities. So I'm very happy to introduce Andrea Wilkins, who is director of the European Cultural Foundation. Welcome, Andrea. Paolo Petruccelli, who is director of the Stauffer Center for Strings in Cremona in Italy, and who knows really a lot from inside on what's happening with the music sector. Peter Keller. Peter, welcome, our partner, Director General of International Council of Museums. Tom Campbell, also our partner from World Cities Culture Forum. Annu Maija Palok, Advisor, Strategic Planning and Innovation, Ministry of Culture, Estonia. And Montserrat Barea Istway, Director of Cultural Management and Program in Barcelona. So welcome, and let's maybe go into our questions. maybe it's not a bad idea to start with looking a little bit again on what's happening with the sectors. So I wanted maybe to ask the first question to Andrea Wilkins, as the European Cultural Foundation really works directly with creative sectors. What are your conclusions on how the current crisis has changed the dynamics and availability of funding for culture? Andrea, please.
Yes, hello. It's great. It's great to be on that panel. And already the first presentation was very insightful. And maybe I'll come back to this in a minute. But just talk about the philanthropic sector and our experience. The philanthropic sector, and especially the arts and culture sector, has been very active in this crisis. We're part of the Arts and Culture Network of the European Foundation Center, now called Philea, and we've been coordinating during the whole year. And many foundations actually own their own arts and culture center, museums, theaters, and others. So they have invested throughout this period despite uncertainties of their own funding. So I think from both data we have and anecdotal evidence, one can say there was a tremendous effort by the philanthropic sector. So simply to keep things going as much as possible. But looking at it from a European perspective, our lesson was that most of the funding went directly locally, very much. So it was a certain reinforcement to what one would say localism. And that is not a bad thing, of course. You support local initiatives in the best way you possibly can. But what was challenged is all the kind of cross-border European networks in the arts and culture sector. So suddenly everyone went local, and the only source of funding really was the European Commission and government, well, not only government, because most government support also went very local. And so there was only the European Commission, and which also did a good job, but actually was relatively limited funding. I mean, the European Commission is not a major arts and culture funder in the big scheme of things. This is mainly at national level. So I would say to a certain extent, you could see during this crisis a renationalization and a localization. So over many decades, you had tremendous networks being set up, and suddenly they sort of well, they didn't disappear, but they were challenged, partly also because of border closure and so on, so real things, but much could have moved also to the digital phase. So our response as the European Cultural Foundation was to set up in March 2020 already a Culture of Solidarity Fund. So to try to do something to say, okay, let's do whatever is possible to keep things going, but not forget the European dimension. And I think that was important. And then when the EU recovery plan came into existence, the same thing happened there again. It was a great achievement actually at the European level in this crisis to create this 750 billion fund, but arts and culture was nowhere to be seen initially. This didn't play a role at all. And so we launched a campaign together with our partners from Culture Action Europe and Cultura Nova, Europa Nostra. These things up. Sorry, hopefully there's no one there from Europa Nostra.
Maybe Deshka is not here with us. But
so Europa Nostra to launch a campaign for a culture deal for Europe, to say to pledge at least 2% of the recovery fund for culture And actually it has changed. So we are seeing now in some countries more than 2%. I mean, for example, in Italy, 4%
In
being
Czech
dedicated.
Republic as well is 4%.
Czech Republic, I mean, there are many countries, some of them haven't pledged anything, and they say we deal with it locally. But actually, overall, we probably will meet this 2%, not in all countries. Some of them are more, but I think that is a big achievement, even so probably more is needed. So basically, I would say there is a crisis management issue that Europe or trans-border activities are simply forgotten when really, what one would say, the shit hits the fan, then everyone goes local. But we need systems in place that shouldn't happen. And philanthropy is not enough, or it actually is a systemic risk in a sense that there is not enough pan-European philanthropy also in the arts and culture sector, but overall. So I think that's for
Maybe
me one of the key lessons.
Absolutely. And I'll be interested to maybe discuss a bit more with you on the philanthropy responses a bit more deeper. But let's continue this a bit of a rapid overview to understand how the funding dynamics or balance of fundings changed during the crisis. And let's look into what's happening in the music sector. And for this, I wanted to ask Paolo Petrocelli to share your views, please, on how has the current crisis changed the dynamics and the availability of finance to support the music sector, of course, through the crisis, and maybe with a bit of medium long-term perspective as well. Paolo, please.
Good morning, everyone. Well, of course, the music sector was completely devastated by this pandemic, and it was completely shaped. I have to say that it was really, interesting to analyze and observe the scenario during the last 12 months, because I saw two major dynamics. One was the awareness from many institutions, organizations, that we are actually having a problem in lacking of technology inside theaters, concert halls, etc., etc. We were thinking until 2 years ago that innovation in the music sector was, being on YouTube, having a Facebook account or wherever. So we were focusing a lot on social media and, of course, on the digital distribution. But actually, in the way we make music and we make art inside theaters and concert halls, we realized that we were very, very far from what we need right now today, meaning digital infrastructure in every theater, in every concert hall. So it was interesting to see how we were dealing with this gap. On the other hand, it was so moving to see the reaction of people all around the world that they were using, especially in the very hard months of the lockdown everywhere in the world, they were using music to express themselves in a very natural way. So they were reaffirming that music is so essential to everybody around the world. What we can do now with this awareness that we need to innovate from a side and the other, that people need music. Well, I think that it's time, of course, to take courage and change some of the models that are regulating the music sector, especially in Europe. I have to say, I was very proud to be a European citizen during the pandemic and being a professional working in the music sector, because we realized that funding from the governments at every level, from national level and European level, actually saved the sector, while in other areas of the world, like the United States, which relies most likely on private funds, the sector was completely devastated. They were not able to even make digital activities during the year because of this, because of course the priority of the private sector was different. For sure, in Europe, we have a possibility to make a real change because of this support coming from the States, national level and European level. Maybe we can do even more if we find a way to attract the private sector in a very strategic way, because it's the combination, of course, public and private sector that is going to project into the future the music sector in a very positive way. I can share very quickly an experience that I'm having here in Italy. I'm working here in Cremona with a private foundation that is investing since 50 years in music education. As a totally private foundation, we don't receive any public funds, and we are investing in the future of music. So we are investing in education. We are supporting hundreds and hundreds of young musicians. We just completely restored an historical building that was devastated and abandoned for the last 20 years. We are hiring a team of young professionals. Everyone is under 40. We are investing on technology, and we are offering all our programs free of charge for all the students here. So, of course, we are lucky because we are able to do that, but we are also trying to make an investment on with a long-term vision. So this is possible. Definitely the private sector should understand, also the needs of the communities and also for sure support the next generations of musicians and professionals. Of course, it's even better if we can join forces with the public sector, but it's not needed. You can actually do it on your own if you want. And this is possible. And here in Cremona, we are demonstrating that this is possible. And you can actually be also of inspiration for many others, private organizations, but also you can be of inspiration for the public sector. It's not true that things can change. Things can change depending by the vision, by the projects, and also by what I like to define, the social mission. We need to rediscover the social mission of our organizations. We need to be useful. It's not just about making music because music is beautiful. We need to make music understanding the needs of our local communities, national communities. And most of the time, and I conclude here, many, for instance, in Italy, orchestras and theaters are struggling because they receive most of the time quite a good support from the government, from the public sector, but they are not able to engage the local communities. They're not able to let citizens understand the importance of what they are doing. And maybe it's because the social mission, again, of this cultural institution is not updated. Is not updated. And this is also because we are most probably not giving the opportunity to a new generation of policymakers, of politicians, of cultural professionals to design the cultural strategy of tomorrow. So more courage, more space to the next generation of professionals of culture, more communication between the public and private sector, but more courage, everyone, to change, to make a real change. It's not just about money, as the title of this seminar. It's about a vision, it's about ideas, it's about really giving space to a new way of making culture everywhere in the world, I will say.
Yes, thank you so much, Paolo. There's, I think, a lot of energy there and a lot of inspiration. And you underlined, yes, that, well, the different impacts in Europe versus US for obvious reasons, and that's good to note. And I really loved that you highlighted how things are at the local level. And, well, there is a bit of connection also with what Andrea was saying. But so, for me, one of the big takeaways is that, yes, the cultural sector itself should maybe recognize and incorporate this broader mission of an agent of social and economic change locally. And you were saying also another point is that, of course, the private sector and the foundations, they can in fact also inspire the public sector in ways to, well, not only invest, but also connect with the local communities, etc. And yes, we need a little bit of a longer term vision there as well. But let's now maybe hear about museums in terms of how this funding dynamics changed over the past maybe 18 months, and what are like the lessons learned and how the landscape maybe will look like in the immediate future. And for this, I'm turning to Peter Keller, please.
Thank you for Katja. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak. It's very interesting to hear the different perspectives, yours and Paolo's, to connect them. If you say, Katja, that the funding of culture is subnational, yes, from our point of view, the majority of museums are municipal and regional, they're not national, even if museums like the Louvre are always in the focus. But the local role of local museums for local communities is much more important. Maybe I can speak about that later. And it's the same as Paolo spoke about the social mission. Of course, the social value of museums is much on our agenda now. It was before, and it is even more now. Maybe I can speak about later, and first speak about the situation, because when the pandemic broke out last year, we said as ICOM, we do not know what's going on. Nobody has information. So we just launched 3 surveys in April, September 2020, and then in April this year again, to get an idea of what's going on. And it was clear that in spring last year, almost all museums all around the world were closed, 95%. And of course, this meant a huge impact on the funding, which became fragile and precarious for many museums during this period. The data shows the long-lasting consequences for finances and for audience. Of course, both are connected, because many museums rely on public sector funding on the one hand, and on the other hand, on sales revenue, sales of tickets, and this means or in the museum shops, which means, of course, visitors coming to museums. And this had, of course, impact on the generally. It looks as if seems that museums that rely on public funding seem more stable during this crisis, with lower percentages of negative economic impacts, whereas a part, of course, of the loss of public funds themselves, and museums that rely on earned income still less fewer impacts than museums that rely on private or endowment funds, which seem to have been more hit by the crisis. If you look at the details, figures, we found that 70% of the museums, for example, had lost more than half of their visitors, and 44% more than half their revenues, which is quite harsh, of course, with huge differences, of course, between the big museums in tourism areas and the small museums in, let's say, non-tourism areas, where the public is more local, but also the funding, of course, is lower. The museums reacted immediately. As I said, they closed, but this meant, of course, they reduced their activities, and they are still reducing their activities. Half of the respondents said that the museums decreased their programs. And today, 5% of the respondents fear that the museum will close, with clear differences from region to region. And in Europe and North America, this percentage is lower, whereas it's higher in Latin America, and especially in Arab countries, where the threat seems very high. The museums are also downsizing staff. 16% of the respondents said that staff has been furloughed or laid off. And there, especially freelance or temporary contracts are concerned, which means in the answers, 1/3 of the freelancers think about leaving the sector. And this is certainly a long-term effect, because these freelancers are often young professionals. They start their career, they do not have found a position yet. So this means the sector might lose young workforce here. And I think this is, maybe I can speak later about strategies and the future. This is certainly something we have to look into in the future as a museum sector. Maybe I stop here. I send the link in the survey where you find the details in the chat. And maybe I can speak later about long-term strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. It will be great to dive into the long-term strategies. But yes, the situation is, I remember we're discussing this in April 2020. And yeah, we hoped that at this stage, 2022, the situation would have been different, but it's still quite
the situation is
worrying.
getting better.
Yep.
If you look, we look from survey to survey, the perspectives are, I might say brighter, but brightening up, let's say. But still, there is a huge threat for especially, as I said, freelance young professionals, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not out of the woods yet. Let's maybe also have a bit brief a reflection from the government perspective as well, and from the city perspective. Anu-Maija, in Estonia, how what's your look? How the funding for cultural and creative sectors behaved, changed over the past 18 months, 2 years, from your perspective, Anu-Maija?
Thank you, and hello to everybody. It seems like it has been years since we lived in normal situation, because during past 18 months, 20 months, and so many things have happened that it's even difficult to describe the situation, what it was before the pandemic. Although the pandemic caused a rapid change in approach how the government is funding the cultural creative sector. So all the previous instruments, schemes, support mechanisms were focused on the traditional cultural creative value chain in order to support creation, to support production, to support distribution. And as mentioned before, lots of attention was paid to internationalization, the international activities, international exposure, and so on. And then suddenly, as a result of a lockdown, we had to focus on local issues. So on the government level, instantly discussions started how to cope with the situation, and mainly how to deal with the costs related to the pandemic and lockdown. Not that much how to cope with the crisis in the future or in the nearest future. So I would say most of the support schemes for cultural creative sector were about to cover the costs, the fixed costs. It was agreed that we focus on people, which means we try to preserve the jobs as much as possible, even so that people involved in cultural creative sector have access to general employment schemes that supported retaining the jobs. And it was only this year where on a government level, on a ministry level, we started to elaborate the support schemes and intervention methods, how to focus in the future. Because it's clear now that the crisis is something we have to cope with, and cultural creative sector, the people, the institutions operating in it need to be prepared in a better way than previously. And also what we realized that there are priorities, and priorities are the institutions, the subsectors which are more related to public funding. for example, when we talk about theaters, the concert organizations, museums as well. And to be honest, it was really hard to fight for SMEs in cultural creative sector. But if we think for a moment whether it was also an advantage for SMEs, so as they did not have so good access to public funding, they had to find the other way, the more innovative way, how to survive. Or even we are seeing the trend that many SMEs are not active anymore. So whether they finished their business, started their business in other field, for example, or they are changing their business models in quite extreme way. Majority of the funding went for preserving the situation, but this is obvious as we try to maintain a strong and functioning cultural field in Estonia, to preserve the cultural memory, to give more value to it. And in my opinion, the less attention was paid to the role of a culture and creativity in the society. As what is the role of culture and creativity in a society, especially when dealing with crisis and all the issues related to it. So this is the topic which is not very well presented, but everything that has to do with preserving the culture, especially the cultural institutions and the cultural fields that are very dependent on public funding, are getting the biggest attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anu-Maija, and it's extremely helpful also for us to understand from how national governments think from inside on these issues. And of course, you had aligned this path from emergency support and crisis management into thinking about what are the medium and long-term objectives, and the putting some priorities as well. And you mentioned that, of course, the priorities went to support the institutions and some of the subsectors, maybe those that are traditionally subsidized, and some other sectors maybe would not be getting as much support as the others, but maybe they can still, this leaves place for correcting some of the framework conditions. And I know that there is a lot of interest in improving access of self-employed creatives to the traditional support schemes. So there is this big issue of access to social benefits for creatives, and also access of firms to SME finance and others. So yeah, thank you very much for providing this perspective. Tom, maybe very briefly, and we'll have a chance to discuss in much more detail later. World Cities Culture Forum, you unite, I think, something like 40 mega cities across the world, not just Europe, but really very, very global thing. From your cities perspective, maybe the top 2-3 points that come to mind on how cities see the what are the main changes in the culture funding and investment landscape now.
Thanks, Katia, and hello from London. As Katia says, I'm from the World Cities Culture Forum. I'm just going to give you two, as Katia says, I'm just going to give you 2 or 3 points, many of which actually fit very well from what's been said earlier from Paolo and Peter and people in particular. So I think it's a good time for me to just quickly come in with some insights from the World City Culture Forum. Every year we survey our members of the world cities and the 40 or so members, and we ask them a set of questions, in particular around funding priorities and their investment plans. And I'm just going to get, and from that survey, I'm just going to give you two or three main themes that have emerged, which I think will fit very well to this discussion. So first of all, the first one, and you don't hear this often from the United Kingdom these days, is optimism. So actually, according to city governments, so our network is made up of world city governments, 92% of our members said that they expect culture to be a more important priority for their city government post-pandemic. So what you're seeing there is a real understanding and appreciation that in the crisis that cities have expected, culture has a real role to play in terms of how the cities respond, their resilience, and how they recover. So in terms of the city funding for culture, our members feel optimistic, and they feel the next, whatever happens, there will be substantial cultural funding. But it will be different, and there are two or three ways in which the cultural funding is changing. First of all, something that emerged very strongly and fits exactly with what Peter was saying is there has been a real concern around freelancers, individuals, and artists. So we are seeing who has, for all the reasons Peter and others have talked about, have especially suffered in the pandemic. And I know Paolo, the musician, knows this all too well with musicians. So there is a real emphasis to try and support them. So we are seeing funding programs from city governments that are trying to fund individuals rather than institutions. So some of the traditional structures and funding bodies and institutions and organizations that have more easily received funding from city governments, a lot of governments are trying to find ways in which we can get money directly to them. So in some examples, so in New York City, they've had a scheme called Creatives Rebuild New York. So they're giving small individual grants directly to artists, visual artists, animators, to work, to do projects in New York. San Francisco have been pioneering an artist corps, they call it, which is essentially a universal basic income scheme for artists. So they've done some experiments where they've just given artists in Francisco a fixed amount of income every month so they can survive, and allowing them the freedom to be creative and do their work. There are similar schemes in Vienna and in Seoul in South Korea, and indeed in London. I put something on the chat. The Mayor of London has launched a creative freelancer pledge. So it's funding directly for individuals and freelancers. And that again reflects the real anxiety, particularly in London, of how many of our artists, how many of our creative professionals have not had access to the kind of protections and support that you would in a larger business. And so we're trying to get funding directly to them. And I think that will continue. I think that's something that will be a substantial shift.
Yeah, Tom, I really would like to, and I guess our audience as well, to learn much more about these perspectives from different cities, and well, especially as you are providing not just broad theoretical things, but how exactly cities are addressing this. But I wanted to go back for a minute, and then we can continue more in detail on what cities are doing. I wanted to go back for a minute to André, and as I know he also has to leave us very shortly, and we really need to understand a bit better, and we'll value your perspective on maybe two things. One big question is, what is the crisis impact on philanthropy finance, and what are the long-term perspectives? Okay, now philanthropies are investing a lot. In the medium and long term, what's your take? And on partnerships, for example, you launched the Cultural Deal for Europe, and you promote this new European model for public and philanthropic partnership. What are the key ingredients of this model, and how can the public sector, national, local, be a meaningful partner in these partnerships? Please, André.
Yeah, first question, difficult. I mean, no one knows. I mean, last year, at a certain point, many foundations also looked very anxiously at their finance, because lots of it, of course, was in the stock market. And then at some point it dived, but then at the end of the year, it looked very good again. So people got more relaxed. And so far, at least the foundations which have a big endowment, they are doing very well out of the stock market. But this is all paper money. So unrealized money for many. So whether they put it directly into the foundation and philanthropy, that's another question. Most foundations are relatively conservative and only take a certain percentage out of the gains from the stock market. And also one has to see what actually happens in the next few months. So it's very volatile, I would say. And most foundations are careful. Also, there are good examples, and I include my foundation, where we make an advance payment in 2020. So we invested more and dived into some of our reserves to make things happen. And also, we didn't mention that so far, increased flexibility in every aspect. So, I mean, extended contracts to whatever date was possible, to change almost all the activities to whatever was possible. I think that was also an important element, and actually also a learning curve for foundations in terms of changing their ways of working and making them more flexible. The second thing about partnerships, well, we advocate for a better model of public philanthropic partnerships, because at the moment, the most used model is that foundations have to behave like grantees. They have to write a proposal to whatever, the European Commission or a government, to get a project co-funded. Well, in fact, what they want is they want to put their money together with public money in a joint venture. But in most administrative processes, that's not possible or very difficult. So we advocate for a new approach where you actually could discuss things at the same level and say, okay, we put 50% and you put 50%, and let's do something together. Or, I mean, a multi-funder approach. So, for example, our culture of solidarity, we set up as a multi-funder approach. Now, many foundations have joined, but the public sector, which was very interested, couldn't join, because basically we would have to write a proposal to any possible grant scheme, and that makes it difficult. So I think we need to define new models of public philanthropic partnership, matching funds, maybe set up new foundations which are open for both sides to join. And we understand that the European Commission is thinking about similar ways, and also learning from what is possible already at national or local level. So I think that's a very interesting avenue, where basically you put things together, and especially also for foundations at the local level, they have a much better understanding what's going on locally. I mean, Italian foundations are very interesting examples in this respect. So I expect a lot of things to move. There's a lot of openness from the philanthropic sector. And maybe, and I would also pick up on the optimism side. Out of this crisis, we are forced to reinvent things. We can't just go back to a model of 2019, because some of these things didn't work even in 2019 or 2018. This wasn't a perfect world. So we are forced to invent new things which are much better than whatever we had. So I see some possibility in that, and specifically also related to the public philanthropic partnerships. And I'm sorry I have to leave, because I had this meeting arranged before. actually with people in the European Commission. So I don't want to let them hang in the Zoom space.
Yes. No, thank you so much. And you leave us with a bit of an optimistic note, saying that in fact the foundation's finance is not in such a bad state, hopefully for the next. And then, yeah, very, very good messages about the injecting the flexibility in the management of grants, and then these new models of partnership. So thank you very much, Andrea, and I hope we'll be able to continue the conversation in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to turn to Paolo, and I know Paolo as well, you have another meeting. If you still are with us for another couple of minutes, I wanted to ask you about this Future Stage initiative and the manifesto that you launched. Maybe you can say a few words about this as well, please.
Briefly, yeah. Along with the group of colleagues coming from the performing arts sector, we decided to create this research group as part of the Meta Lab at Harvard University, one of the most dynamic research institutes in Harvard. The idea was simple. We realized that beside all the different network organizations and think tanks, wherever, still we miss a global discussion about, the common challenges in the performing arts sector. And when you analyze 1, 2, 3 issues of the performing arts sector, fundraising, innovation, from different geographical point of views, you realize that we still have so much to do in terms of just talking each other. If we talk about fundraising in Italy, for sure we will address certain priorities. If we talk about fundraising in South Africa, it's completely different. If we talk about fundraising in China, completely different. So it's for sure so needed to have a global discussion around these topics. And this is the scope of Future Stage. We launched this manifesto, which is the result of months and months of discussions and talks with a group of 25 professionals from the performing sector. You can find it online. I'll send you later the link here in the chat. We opened the manifesto saying performing is a right, is a human right. Because also talking about the possibility to be an artist, of course, we need to rediscover what means to be an artist today. And again, I like to link the concept of being an artist to the concept of being a citizen. We are always saying, politicians, they don't care about culture. Sponsors, private sector, they don't care about culture. What the artists are doing day after day to let politicians understand the importance of culture, to let corporations understand that it's important to invest in culture. Are we sure that the art sector is doing as much as possible, the cultural sector doing as much as possible to be connected with the society, to understand and anticipate also the changes? We are the creative sector. Let's be creative. Let's shake society. Let's shake a politician. Let's shake the corporation. Let's influence, positive influence. Because, when you're talking about fundraising, if you just go to a corporation in Italy, we have so much, as you know, in terms of heritage. I'm talking from this beautiful historical room, which was abandoned, and how we can project into the future this heritage. Well, it's about connecting this heritage to the present, but especially to the future. And this is, first of all, a duty from the cultural professionals, from the artists, to understand how we can project this into the future. And then we can explain and convince eventually politicians and sponsors to support. But also, I think it's important to say for instance, talking about Italy, the cultural community here is completely disconnected from politics. They say, I just don't care politics. It doesn't relate to me. But then when it's time to say, the government is not supporting enough the museums, the theaters, then they go there and they say, we have bad politicians. But maybe you have to think about this when there are elections. Maybe it's time to vote and bring to the parliament people that are coming also from the cultural sector more and more. So, it's of course so many levels of discussion, but what I'm saying is the global citizens concept should be more at the center of our discussion. Artists, cultural professionals are citizens. We need to be active citizens. Even when we go out our concerts, our concert halls, our theaters, our academies, is not just about making culture within our institutions. It's making culture 24 hours a day in every different context of our society.
Yes, thank you so much, Paolo, for this pledge, and also underlining the needs, well, the capacity building needs of within the cultural sector itself to position it as a equal player among others. And thank you for giving us some extra minutes of your time as well. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Tom, now let's go back to the mega cities and your lessons learned from your membership over the past few years. And I remember, well, when Andrea was saying about the flexibility that philanthropy organizations had to inject over the past few months, I remember one of the first things that Justine Simons mentioned during, well, a year and a half ago, that was one of the lessons from the cities, that maintaining grants, but changing the delivery targets. This was one of the first things that cities were putting in place. So please, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll carry on. No, that's great. And actually, it was very helpful having Paolo there just to say what he said, because that, I think he's gone now, but that connects very closely with another major theme that has emerged in terms of how the funding is changing and the new priorities for city governments, which can be best summarized by the idea of funding cultural ecosystems rather than institutions, which I think is something that I hope resonates with a lot of people around this seminar.
You know, maybe as we attract a lot of people from outside of cultural sectors, maybe we need to underline what this ecosystem is, because there are a lot of skeptics. Well, ecosystems are everywhere, and we use it just a buzzword,
yeah,
etc. I am a true believer that the ecosystem should be funded, but maybe you can also explain why.
Absolutely. So in terms of the funding, just to speak narrowly in terms of the funding, I think what we're seeing is amongst city governments is a new interest in funding at a more holistic and spatial level, rather than funding simply well-established traditional institutions. So this means looking at a whole area and looking at the levels of provision, who is experiencing culture, who is not experiencing culture, who has been difficult to reach, and finding the partners and organizations, private and public sector and voluntary sector, who can best work to support this. So what we're seeing, therefore, in terms of the practical level, is more funding for and more support with multi-use venues. So instead of funding perhaps a museum or a gallery, which has always done that, there is now more interest in funding a shop or a multidisciplinary art space, which is providing a range of different activities, and which is providing a gallery and a place to project, but also an exhibition place, but also a production studio, and also workspace, and also linking it to entertainment and the nighttime economy, and trying to understand how the kinds of cultural and social and economic impacts organizations like that are having within their local economy. So it's trying to take a much more spatial and neighborhood approach to culture. And I'm sure this will resonate a lot with people that are familiar with the idea of the 15-minute city, which is obviously came out of Paris, well, and is now a very important concept. And trying to, and certainly from the city perspective, the funding and the interest is much more on that kind of spatial relationship rather than the individual arts organization. I think as well, just one other thing, so that's going to be an important part in terms of what the future funding will be about. I think it's worth saying, although we're optimistic, from our perspective, and it's very interesting to get different views here, but we are not seeing a big return to philanthropy in our cities. So this is not the hope that this would be a new golden age for philanthropy, for culture, is not happening. Rather, it has been more about using public funding, the city government funding, to work with other funders, to work with businesses, to work with trusts. None of our world cities are reporting that there are wealthy individuals who are wanting to give to the arts and culture in the way that they were before. And I think the latest data that's come out from this has only confirmed that. So how we can work with, it's about how we can work with such partners in a different way. But I don't think we should be under any kind of expectation that there will be some large private individuals who are going to help us out here. And then one other thing that's come across very strongly from our city survey, which we haven't yet discussed, but I'm sure we will, is an increasing concern with issues of sustainability, climate change, and the environment. And we're seeing how funding for arts and culture in cities is increasingly being tied to and connected with those imperatives and the urgency of the climate crisis. So half of our cities, 50% of our world cities, when they invest in cultural venues now, they have guidelines and rules. They have to be low carbon buildings. There has to be efficiency in terms of the buildings. More than 60% of city government culture departments are undertaking cross-departmental initiatives and funding programs with the environmental departments. And I think you're just going to see more of this. Something like 60% of the world city members have declared a climate emergency and are expecting every part of city government to play their part in tackling the crisis. And culture is going to be expected to play an increasing role in this. And I think that's something that started before the pandemic, obviously, but I think the pandemic has made us all the more aware of the urgent need for culture, for environmental issues around sustainability, issues around the existential threats that our citizens all face, to be better linked to how we think about culture and the priorities for funding.
Yes, thank you very much, Tom. That's extremely rich, and yeah. So you added a little bit of doubt on the potential future sources from philanthropy and the wealthy individuals, and yeah, it's good to remind ourselves about this other challenge and other mega trend, the environment, and it's good to see that already in your cities and these mega cities across the world there is this strong cooperation also with the environment department. So that's quite an interesting thing to look at. Maybe I wanted to now turn to Peter to hear a bit more on how the museums reacted to these challenges, and if there are in fact opportunities that we can see emerging in terms of new models of audience engagement related to the digital, and I mean, all these new opportunities, will they materialize in some new funding sources or not really? So yeah, Peter, good to hear from you on the responses and also on the future financial landscape for museums maybe. And then it will be great also to go back to Anna-Maja and Tom for the more the government perspectives as well overall, just for some final remarks. Peter.
Yeah, thank you. I spoke about the challenges before, and the opportunities, of course, are there as well in each crisis. As Paolo already said, for the museum sector as well, the sector is very diverse, not only from country to country, as he said, but it's also from museum type, from region to region. Generally, the museum sector in last year, we compared the economic impact for museums, and it's obvious that the financial support was very important. Museums received from the public side, and the negative impact was lower. If there was, we also saw that the percentage of museums that received support went up from 50 to 65% in 1 year, from last to this year. and shows the need of financial support for the stability of the institutions. At the same time, we see that it is about the opportunities. Larger museums seem to be better equipped than small to medium-sized museums to experiment with new ways now, and especially new ways of generating income, if we speak about the revenues of museums. Museums that rely on earned income and private funds seem to a greater extent be able to generate additional revenues than museums relying on public funding. This should be one reason for this should be that just the staff structure of public institutions is less flexible, and they cannot react as quick as privately organized institutions, let's say. Museums are trying to identify new sources of income. We found that 14% of the museums developed their online shop, 11% developed lockdown products as masks, things like that. You have without doubt seen them. Museums developed paid online products, but at the same time, 60% of the respondents said that they did not experiment with new sources of revenue. And I think this is a huge field to develop this sector in the future. And I think there we are speaking about the smaller museums which do not have the stuff, do not have the experience, and maybe need networks as Tom's networks or others to support them here to develop the income, the funding, the finances of museums. One perspective of the future strategies are certainly the future, the digital strategies. We also saw that 75% of the museums have already rethought their digital strategy. Another main strategic field which was mentioned are accessibility and community outreach, which is very much in line with what we see is that museums, of course, because of the travel restrictions, turn to local and regional audiences and try to recontact, focus on the local public in every aspect. And sustainability, as Tom mentioned, is also in museums, will be on the agenda in the future regarding, there again, different from museum type to museum type. Of course, natural history museums have the evidence of climate change and deal immediately with the topic. But also, let's say, art museums have to think about their future way of working, because sending museum objects around the world for exhibitions is quite expensive and has a huge carbon footprint. So I think there as well. And maybe this goes again with the downsizing of the sector. As the number of exhibitions is going down, it might even be reasonable from a sustainability point of view to rethink what we're doing there. And regarding staff, I already said, I think the museums have to think about how to give staff in the future, especially freelance, as I said, and these are different again from country to country. Certain sectors in Germany, for example, or Austria, the freelance staff is often educational staff for the education programs, outreach programs. Whereas in other countries, as Italy, for example, is across all professional sectors. It's curatorial staff, education staff, and so on. But I think this is, as I said, very important investment in the future of the sector. And all these things which I'm speaking about, in fact, we already spoke about them before. We spoke about sustainability before. We had already addressed the social value of museums, which was mentioned, the social value of the institution, which was mentioned by Paul as well. And I think this goes again with what I said about accessibility and inclusion, that these roles, this social role of museums will be focused in the future. Even after the pandemic, some colleagues said they expect a return to normal, if ever is a normal, maybe in 2 or 3 years, when tourism will come back to cities. Now you have in Paris, you have I think 90% less of American visitors and 100% less of Asian visitors, which is, of course, has an impact on income of museums in the city. We will see if we will get back there, but I also think, as I said, that the agenda of museums will then have been changed and much more focus on digital, on local communities, inclusion and sustainability, as was said.
Yes, thank you so much, Peter. Yeah, a very broad agenda. I wanted maybe now to turn back to Anu, Maya, and Tom. Well, of course, one of the big questions that we're trying to understand is, well, as we mentioned, the recovery efforts and funds were quite unprecedented across Europe, across countries, and in some of the cities as well. But what about the longer term? I mean, what is your feel both for local government spending? As we know, well, local government budgets are under pressure. They have to shift priorities also to address the health emergency, obviously, and in the years to come, their finances won't be like very much in the green. So, for national governments as well, yes, now, well, Europe invests tremendous amount and very diverse. Creative Europe increased, but also the knowledge and innovation community. The KIC for creative sectors has been launched. The new European Bauhaus, etc. In some of the countries, this investment through the recovery funds continues. But what about what will happen in 2-3 years? What's your perspective on how governments and cities are getting ready for this? Anuma, if I can, or maybe you can also have other reflections on what was already discussed today. Anumaya, please.
Yes. Regarding the funds or funding in the future, and also all the new possibilities available for the member states and also for cultural creative sectors, I have to mention that in Estonia, we are not so lucky ones that it wasn't agreed that we allocate 2% of RRF to culture. So the priorities were elsewhere, but let it be as it is. Still, we've had a quite positive breakthrough in a sense that cultural and creative sector has expressed the willingness to be part of dealing with future challenges as we talk about the sustainability, the climate change, and also in Estonia we have a special region which is a region for the just transition. So just about half a year ago, we really managed to deliver the message to the parliament, to the government, in a way that now we have a group of cultural leaders who are directly connected to the politics. As Paolo said, that unfortunately, cultural community in Italy is not connected to the politics. But here in Estonia, it was a positive impact of the crisis, that there is a group of leaders who represent the film industry, the music, the art, the museums, and so on. And they provide solutions, their expertise, their thoughts, instead of asking for funding. And when speaking on local governments level, I'm a strong believer in local initiatives. So the response from the government should be that those local initiatives are recognized as a potential, and also the local initiatives demonstrate stronger ownership rather than top-down policies or initiatives, although they are needed sometimes in order to achieve some long-term gains and goals. But still, it needs to be further developed how to make this partnership between the government and local governments work in a better way, so that and also how to involve the private sector, because as Andrew mentioned previously, that we need new models and ways to partner with private sector, especially when we talk about investing in culture, not just philanthropy or sponsorship, because the private sector always need something in return, let's to be honest. So whether it's the tax incentives, whether it's the something in dealing with legislation, but still there must be a mutual benefit. And looking at the future, as I mentioned also before, one thing is funding the different processes in cultural creative value chain. Another thing is how to make the sector more sustainable and more resilient in different crisis situations. So it is about knowledge and skills development. It is developing business models. It is developing alternative funding schemes, so that we have done proactively more in order to devote less energy and efforts dealing with consequences. And also, as the crisis made us to look more and deal with local issues, as the international communication and activities were stopped, still the international dimension can't be underestimated, as the local cultural fields and ecosystems are not closed ones. So the culture is a global issue. And also we cannot forget about enormous development of and implementation of digital means during the crisis. So this is something that will develop further, and the cultural creative sector has to adapt and use those benefits in the favor of creating better cultural value for the society in general.
Yes, thank you very much, Anna-Maja, for providing us this longer-term vision and perspective beyond the worries of today. That's very helpful to look at well, there are some bright sides, no, over there in the future. Thank you. Tom, over to you. So what's your reflection on this long-term availability of funding for
I was from the city level, and I was absolutely fascinated to hear what Anna-Maja was talking about there, because that connects very closely to what we are seeing at the city level. So I've maybe confused things by talking about should we be optimistic or pessimistic. What we're really seeing is a change in terms of what's going on, and while I don't think there will be any large amounts of private philanthropy, we're going to see at the city, or indeed an increase in cultural funding. What we're going to see at the city level is certainly cultural funding being maintained, but spent in a different way. And particularly at the city level, there is a particular focus on what Anna-Maja was saying around rather seeing arts and cultural funding as part of a broader social economic strategy and plan for cities. So I think we're going to see less funding for traditional institutions, and one might think, oh, well, that's less funding for museums. But as Peter was saying, that's not the case. Rather, it is for museums, because museums are a hugely varied and diverse and dynamic sector, museums to be doing things in a kind of different way, and working in a different way, and with sort of hybrid models, and integrating exhibition and curatorship and the traditional strengths and skills of museums and galleries with business support, enterprise, workspace, production. And linked to that is a very strong sense in which there will be, we think we're seeing further decentralization, and that's going on from the national level to the city level, but also within the city level. So the world cities that we represent are, of course, very large, enormous. So, you know, London and Paris, you know, we're talking 8 million people, 10 million people. And the city governments within these cities are themselves looking to decentralize and become less hierarchical in terms of how funding is allocated. And we've mentioned the 15-minute city in Paris. Amsterdam has just launched its donut economic vision of the city. Lisbon is doing some very interesting work about participatory budgeting and cultural spaces. I think we're increasingly seeing a way in which the unit for funding and working through culture is less about hierarchies of administrators and large city governments funding major institutions, but rather working at the neighborhood level and looking to see how, and to come back to the ecosystem concept, looking to see how at the neighborhood level and at that unit, cultural organizations, museums, galleries, entrepreneurs, retail can be empowered and invested to do all kinds of really interesting social, economic, and cultural work. So in that sense, I think I think to go back to it's very dynamic. At the city level, it's dynamic, and there are good grounds for optimism in terms of the policy making helping to enable what should be really flourishing, sustainable cities.
Yes, thank you very much, Tom. A lot of food for thought, and yeah, this idea of further decentralization, well, especially in large cities and mega cities, and maybe the related issue of capacity building for the cultural organizations to be able to receive this decentralized mandates and funding. So yeah, a lot of food for thought there. I see there is a parallel conference going on in our chat there with colleagues from Bergen, and I say hello to William Hazel, describing the Zephyr Media Fund. So yeah, maybe for those of you interested, have a look there, but also Joanna Miranda underlying the medium-sized cities agenda, and the importance also, of course, of the big international networks, the UNESCO Creative Cities Network, and also the European Capital of Culture Network there. And yes, I also say hello to colleagues from Nesta, a source of inspiration for many of our work as well. So I don't know, maybe before we turn to Montserrat, if Peter, Anna-Maja, Tom, you still have any thoughts, any last minute ideas you still want to share with us, please, the floor is yours. Say now or hold your breath.
Mm-hmm. If I may refer, because I spoke about the strategies that started already before COVID, give us an example, the guide we developed, OECD and ICOM for museums and local development. We developed in 2018 and 19, immediately before COVID, more or less. And that, and it's, again, I can refer you to what Tom said or to what Joanna Miranda wrote in the chat. The guide provides a roadmap for local development agendas, looking at the power of museums for local economic development and urban regeneration, museums as spaces of inclusion, health and well-being, and how to catalyze culturally aware and creative societies. So looking at museums from very different perspectives and trying to develop policies and agendas for museums from these different perspectives. I think it's a good example of what I said before, of the strategies which will start it before, it will certainly continue after COVID.
Yes, thank you very much, Peter. Yeah, and we know that the guide is being translated in many languages, so people do use it very much. So, Peter and Anna-Maja, any final remarks? So, are you happy for us to conclude? Let us know. Okay. Now, maybe I now turn to Montserrat. Montserrat, in fact, was very much behind this OECD research on funding for cultural and creative sectors. So I'm very eager to discover, Montserrat, what are your key takeaways from this very rich session? And in fact, I'm pretty happy with this table that we hosted now, because it was so diverse perspective. And I think we had really the key players there. So the public sector at national level, but also the cities, the philanthropy organizations, and the sector perspectives as well. So it's rare, I think, that we managed together all these mega players around the same table to discuss these issues. So Montserrat, maybe great to hear your key takeaways and reflections now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katia. And I would like to know if it's possible for me to share my screen, because I will combine a presentation with some amazing takeaways that I could just summarize in a few minutes. So everybody is looking at my screen right now. Yes, wonderful. So, well, I think that we all were privileged to have this amazing group of speakers, because I think that it was clear that they were providing different perspectives from public, from private, from let's say the cultural sector itself, the foundations and the museums and so on. So I think that this is amazing. I think before I will start with this sort of conclusions, I think that the moment that we are living now, it's key, because the pandemic has definitely challenged the cultural sector and the creative and cultural industries as tools for recovery. This is something that has been sort of permeating all over, that we are now in a moment that things can be done different. And this is not only in the cultural sector, it's everywhere, that the crisis, the pandemic, has to be seen as an opportunity rather than as something that, however, I think that we are all a little bit like feeling uneasy in how to move on, how to move forward. And I think that this is probably because we need a little bit more of collective reflection. And this is what I will try to do, just kind of summarizing everything that was said during this seminar. So yeah, that wasn't at the beginning, more than money. And I think that it was clear that money is not the issue. We are talking about the recovery agenda. We are talking about the new funds for culture. This is not the problem. The problem is that we need to consider a broader scope in order to see how culture and cultural and creative sectors can be funded. And please bear with me, because I think that this idea that culture is on one hand side and cultural and creative industries is on another side, I think that we need to be more and more used to the idea that everything goes together. It's not only about culture, understanding culture as something that comes from above and makes us more sensitive and clever. I think that this is and it's important. We are talking about industries, we are talking about business models, we are talking, of course, as well about public funding. So if the answer to is not the money, what is then? I think that, and of course, just understand that that was thought before the presentation, I mean the talk. I think that we need to understand several things. Something that has been said is the importance, the increasing importance of the local milieu, which at the same time has to be parallel with something that has also been stressed during the conversation, which is that we shouldn't forget about the international, we shouldn't close our boundaries. I think that not only because we belong maybe to European or international associations, but it's the fact that today we live in a global world, and we, even if the context is essential, we cannot miss the importance of the international arena. So anyway, I think that what happens in the local milieu is that we do have like a wide range of things. On the one hand side, how do companies behave and which are their internal resources? From skills, somebody mentioned the importance of investing in new skills, because this is something that we have already seen, that museums, for instance, were lacking more technology and more skills on that side, on that idea. Then, for instance, we are, and I think that this is also important, we are seeing an amazing variety source of new funding, new forms of support, not only the traditional, let's say, public support, or which, by the way, public support is not only the cultural ministry. I mean, when we talk about culture and we talk about creative and cultural industries, there are many ministries involved. It's economy, competitiveness, education, it's culture, of course, but this is important. And I would like to say something about the idea of working together. It is clear that new partnerships and new alliances are needed. I love the idea of, we don't want to co-fund, we want to do joint ventures together. And in order to, that was said during the conversation. So that means that it is not about, let's do things, I mean, you do your side, I do my side, let's do things together, and let's try to evaluate things together. So very important, how can we do that with the current regulation? And that moves me to another topic, which is the regulatory framework, not only for let's say, how can money reach the needed people. It is also about how can we regulate partnerships and how the public involvement can be better eased along this way. Again, the external conditions are currently very critical. We know that. We know that there were different priorities. We know that in the short term, the people were the most important. It has been mentioned that freelancers, individual workers, curatorial professionals, all these kind of people that sometimes are outsourced, they were the ones who were receiving the first aid, let's say that. But we cannot, this is important, I'm not saying that, but I think that we have to elaborate on the medium and long term, and we need to see how funding can contribute to something that has also been said, which is that it is not only about the dissemination of culture, it's because culture is an essential part to achieve other challenges like sustainability. It has been said here, but also there are some other things like, and that was said about the importance of the neighborhood and the community and how culture can create this kind of, let's say, inclusionary idea that we all belong to the same society, some sort of, no? Let's move a little bit in the presentation. Here you have this idea that the ecosystems are important. I think that this is something that has been also said, that we do have more people, more stakeholders involved in the ecosystem, and somehow this varied range of actors rely or lie on the local arena, and this is important, how the local arena welcomes these actors, and up to what extent these actors is like a kind of bidirectional influence, how these actors are embedded in the local sector and how the local sector can offer opportunities to them. Not only money, we talk about collaboration, we talk about reputation, we talk about trust. This is something that is intrinsic to cultural and creative industries, and this is also important when we look at how can they be funded. I don't know why, but here. So I think that there has been a kind of shift that has also been noticed during the conversation, which is that culture was something that was definitely top-down sponsored. It was the public sector mainly national, with some kind of devolution to the local arena. But that we have seen before the pandemics even that the private sector has been engaging in the funding of the creative and cultural industries and of culture as well. So somehow, as I said before, I think that this is something to take into account, that the actors maybe are the same, but the importance of them is changing. So again, and that was something that was also mentioned during the conversation, is that, so what do we need to fund? I mean, it is a museum. Let's put money in terms of creating a new museum, maybe. I think that there is a need of recognition of what is needed for culture and creative and cultural industries in order to adapt new funding models to which are their needs. And sometimes we miss that idea that since things are changing, we mentioned during the conversation, or you mentioned, the importance of digitalization. Digitalization is definitely a tool that sometimes we assume that is already there, but it is not. So maybe rather than investing in new museums, and I'm just saying that as an example, it would be nice to see which are those that are already existing, which are their needs. I think that, and I will be very, because I think that that was not very much mentioned during the conversation, but I think that the role of the public sector might be changing in the future, and that would be, or that would represent a shift from direct support to indirect support, not from grants to taxes or exemption of taxes, but more on the idea of how the public sector can relate to the private stakeholders that are in the position of providing some kind of funding. There is something in the slide, which is that sometimes private agents, philanthropy, sponsorship, and we know that these are different things, but they might be more attracted by eye-catching projects. How can the public sector provide room for thought for these stakeholders in order to be more aware of which is needed, which challenges could be faced by both sides, by the public sector and also by the private sector. Again, and this is, I will be very quick on that. We said already that a stable regulatory framework is needed, not only in terms of partnerships, that was our alliances. I think that it is important to understand how these governments can, let's say, work together with private stakeholders. How, I mean, rather, as I said before, from co-doing things to joint ventures, right? I think, yeah, I think that it something that was mentioned by our Italian colleague, which was the need to involve cultural leaders with the politicians, no? And I think that this is a very interesting. We know that there are many lobbies from cultural professionals associated, because of course that cannot be done at an individual level. But and I think that there should be more permeation in between this kind of think tanks that emerge from the sector to the public sector. I think that, and in particular to politicians that are the ones that are looking at how politics can be, or policies can be designed. Again, something that already we saw during the conversation is that there are, and this is the moment for hybrid models in cultural and creative industries, but hybrid models in politics, in policies, sorry. And I think that, again, we have to recognize that there are already different rationales to why do I have to invest in culture or culture and creative industries? So that come maybe from the economic return, but again, the social reward. And that was also mentioned, that we need to reinforce that part. I mean, cultural and creative industries and culture in general, they contribute to something else rather than economic benefit. This is a complex slide. I'm almost finishing. I think that building bridges of dialogue is something that could be essential to improve the financial relationship. We know that sometimes artists and cultural organizations do not fit in financial stakeholders' needs. I mean, they don't go well together, but there is a role for other actors to engage and to provide a better fitting in between one part of the ecosystem and the other. I'm going to skip that one, and I think that I will skip that one. I just want to stop here, which is almost the last, which is a sort of recommendation for the government, whatever it is, the national, it depends, on the regional or the local. I think that it is important to find out which are the objectives, the common agreed objectives in terms of cultural policy. And I am a researcher. I think that we are in need of reliable indicators. It is so hard to find comparable indicators, even in terms of finance of cultural and creative industries and culture itself. Again, the design of the stable framework for cooperation and to facilitate this cooperation. Sometimes foundations do have the feeling that it is so hard or it is so complicated to go through the bureaucratic process that they just put it aside somehow. No? Again, acting as leveraging private investment. I think that this is something for the public sector to take into account, how to align public objectives with private investment, and they are the ones to do that. And finally, because of the diversity, I think that Katia started talking about the diversity of the sectors, the heterogeneity of those involved. I think that policies cannot be the same for everybody. I think that the tailor-made policies are essential, even in terms of finance. And again, we do need sustainable business models. We do have to imagine a world where culture can be sustainable and not in terms of carbon footprint only, right? So thank you very much. I think that it was so rich, the conversation. I hope that I managed to. I know that there are some questions and answers, so thank you very much. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Montserrat, for this very rich overview. Well, it's not just takeaways from the discussion, but a much richer content there. Yes, maybe for me, just maybe to close the circle, we started with, the session was really about the role of public finance, right? So, I mean, what I take away is that, yes, the public sector will continue to invest in culture as a merit good. But as some priorities, well, some choices have to be made, there should be also a big impact on correcting the market failures in terms of access of creative sectors to innovation supports, as business development supports, etc. So, or self-employment supports. And there is this growing recognition, because of the growing recognition of culture across policy areas and policy portfolios, there is this chance and opportunity for increased public funding coming not necessarily from cultural budgets, but from, as we were hearing, budgets for environmental departments, and then we know also employment departments and other policy areas. So maybe this is a bit of a complementary or reinforcing what Montserrat and other speakers were saying. Well, with this, I think I'm extremely happy with the discussion, and I would like to thank our speakers. Of course, well, Andrea Wilkins and Paolo Petrocelli, who were with us early in the morning, and a big thank you to Tom Campbell, Anu Maya, and Peter. It was great to have you with us, and I hope you also enjoyed this conversation. And so now we'll have a break, and I'll see you at 2 o'clock Paris time, and we'll have another great session, and where we'll focus more on the investment and funding for more market-oriented sectors, right? And we'll have Bernd Fezel from the European Creative Business Network, and we'll have, in fact, the investors themselves, Olivier Schulbaum, who is the vice chair of the European Crowdfunding Network, Vincent Favrat, a business angel and the founder of Scale Up Factory. And we'll also have Josephine Hager with us, Deputy Director of Creative Saxony. So let's reconnect again at 2 o'clock, and see you in a couple of hours then. Thank you. Thank you to all. Bye.